this week's episode of Signs, I'm absolutely delighted to receive Anna Feigenbaum to talk about Greenham Common webs. Anna is a writer, professor, and interdisciplinary scholar working at the University of Glasgow. Her research and practice explore culture, communication, and social movements. She has published widely on Greenham Common, documenting feminist peace activism, memory, and media. Her books include Protest Camps, published by Bloomsbury in 2013, and Tear Gas, published by Verso in 2017. Yeah, so hi, Anna Feigenbaum. So I'm absolutely thrilled that you can come on today and talk about Greenham Common.
Great. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
So initially, the sign that I was interested in exploring was, the anti-nuclear sign that a lot of people know about Greenham Common. And in your response, you said that actually the sign that was perhaps more motivating, stimulating intellectually for you to explore was this sort of spider web, non-violent webs that appeared all over Greenham Common.
Yeah, so the Greenham Common is associated with a number of different kinds of signs and symbols. And they did, of course, use, if you mean the peace sign, by the anti-nuclear sign, like the CND's anti-nuclear sign.
The CND, yeah, the peace sign, yeah, there's a lot of,
Yeah, well, they did have lots of that too, but we've seen that across a lot of movements, and it historically is from a bit earlier than Greenham. So I was thinking about the web because it's something that was quite distinct to Greenham, and it's something that really captured the way that as a social movement it grew over time, because one of the things people don't realize is that, Greenham started in 1981. Actually, the last woman to leave left in 2001. So the camp actually had a really long and rich, very varied population, but a long and rich history, and it went through a lot of different changes. And so the web captures a lot of the different moments and different things about Greenham's politics that hopefully we'll dive into today.
Yeah. It's a good reminder, actually, that just how long it perdured, Greenham. I didn't realize it carried on so long, so that it ended so recently. Of course, my imagination of it is linked very strongly to the 80s. And so that has a particular color, doesn't it? I'm sure that as you said, the type of woman, the type of person, the type of activist who went to Greenham Common in the 80s would be different now to the type of activist who would go in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like stragglers that were left towards the end of the camp. So people who had really made their lives there, moved their caravan in, were just kind of set up. So I don't know how I think the head count was pretty small in the last few years. So yeah, it was in that the early 80s is really the kind of peak time. And one of the interesting things, and I don't know if you want us to just give the listeners a little bit of the background of how the protest camp started.
Absolutely, yes,
yeah,
please.
It might be useful. So it was actually semi-accidental that there was a protest camp there. So a group of women had agreed to march from Cardiff in Wales to the nuclear military base in Newbury because they wanted to mark the sitting of U.S. nuclear cruise missiles. It's a little too eerie how much this sounds like today, but they wanted to mark that the UK was being used as part of the kind of U.S. war machine. And so they went to this nuclear base to raise attention, get some media coverage of the sitting of these U.S. nuclear cruise missiles. And the idea was that base is closer to Russia. So this is in the Cold War kind of context. So when they got there, they just decided that they weren't going to leave. So the protest camp kind of started with people just bringing things in and starting to build there. And then it was the military base had a 9-mile perimeter fence, if I'm not mistaken on the number. And so there was lots of different gates all around this military base. And so it started quite small. This is just I think it was something like 30 or 35 women did the first march. And then people just started coming slowly. And then they started doing these bigger events. And at the peak, there were, dozens, hundreds of women at all of the different base encampments all around that fence. And at the kind of peak of the big actions, you would have tens of thousands of people gathering at Greenham. So, and lots of visitors. You had people who were living there. You had people who would come for the weekend. You had people that would come just for the day. So you had this kind of really, what we talk about in social movement studies is a kind of convergence space or convergence center, like almost like a big kind of expo of activism going on. So all kinds of things got done there and made there. And that's where a lot of the signs come in.
Absolutely. And these, the different gates you're talking about, I seem to remember there were different colors. It was almost color coded as well, which I think is a wonderful form of sign symbolism. Like the colors representing different, I forget exactly.
Yeah, it was the colors of the rainbow. So there was a different, I think they had a gate for every color of the rainbow. There was, I know that the big ones were yellow, green, blue, and indigo. And then the gates had different personalities. And that they decided to do, which I think is a brilliant bit of politics, is they, I think like one gate you were like allowed to express more religious stuff at. And then there was another gate that was, I think it was the blue one, that was like a little more anarcho. And so like if you wanted certain kinds of self-expression, you could go to the gate that like best matched your self-expression. And so it was a way of including everyone, but at the same time, kind of, I would imagine there were a lot of fights that went on in meetings over like what was allowed and not allowed as part of the protest. And so instead of having to make a decision, they're like, okay, we'll put you at this gate, you can be at this gate. And then I think the gates also like developed their own sort of microcultures because people, you know, were living there. And so they had different kinds of personalities, which I just find fascinating as a bit of collective living, you know.
Absolutely. As a sort of the sort of organic creation of different forms of activism as well. Like I may be mistaken, but the blue gates being associated with more direct action.
That rings a bell to me as well, because it was kind of the more anarcho, you know, gate. So there was a little bit more like direct action that was happening there. And then Yellow Gate was like that people came to. So I think Yellow Gate was a little bit more public facing, media savvy, kind of welcoming the visitors.
Yeah, so you'd have this contingency at gates like the Blue Gate, where you'd have this meeting of public and institutional bodies, you know, that the potential violence perhaps was greater at certain gates. I can imagine, you know, the Green Gate, which was linked to ecology, because, you know, we're very creative, aren't we, as human beings? It was, that was effectively wonderful to learn about how the people there, the populations, gradually increased and created these different spaces that were needed, that were, I mean, I always wonder how, I suppose people have done studies about that as well, about the sort of, the complexity of the organization of these things, how they come to emergence. But I mean, you know way more about this than I do. But I was wondering actually about, you've written about levier d'état, you know, the Foucauldian punir, surveiller, all of these devices that the state has, in particular tear gas that you've written about, I think.
I have. No tear gas at Greenham.
Sorry?
There's not tear gas at Greenham.
No, right, okay. Was that because it just didn't exist as a device at the time?
Tear gas is not as used. So it's not that it didn't exist in the 90s in the UK, because the UK was one of the earlier producers of tear gas, but they were using it at that time. It was a little bit more, would be like individual officers, and it wasn't regular, like it wasn't rolled out to the police until the 90s in the UK. So in France, I'm sure they would have been using it. People, they love using tear gas, and people in France and in the US, they would have been using it. But it's just not very commonly used on protesters in the UK. Like it's actually just quite rare. Okay. It's, if anything, it's like more of the spray that is used in an individual situation, and even that is much less than in other countries. So it just has to do with, there's different modes of policing, and the UK does a lot more of containment and surveillance style policing. So it's just a different kind of like protester police interaction than you get in a more brutalist kind of French and US system of policing. Which has different historical roots. France is in fact the originator of tear gas, we think.
Oh, really? Yeah, how am I not surprised?
Yes. And it's because you'll like this. This is a fun French fact. It's because The French are so good at building barricades, the French protesters, and the police needed ways to break through French barricades. So they experimented with tear gas. This is what we think. We haven't found earlier historical records. So they think that it was police experimenting with it in the early 1900s. And then in the war, they developed it in the First World War. So the French were actually thought to be the first to use it in the First World War, and then the Germans caught up and retaliated.
Right.
And it became
global
after that.
Yeah, there were various gases floating around at that time.
Not to say that the police weren't violent at Greenham, to bring it back to Greenham, but they did a lot of destruction of the camp, demoralizing of the women. Occasionally, I think people would get pushed or shoved, or maybe, with a billy club, but it was much more of a kind of psychological wearing down. It's the British policing way, and making it really hard for them to live, to stay there.
Yeah. Like the material existence.
Yeah, just destroying the camp. Yeah. And then they'd build all these shelters and a kitchen, and then the police or the bailiffs would come and just knock it all down and ruin all of it, and then they'd have to rebuild. So it's kind of similar to the ways that refugee camps are sometimes policed.
Yes, it's we're not saying this is over. No, we're not categorically shutting it down, but we're going to a bit like the what is it, the cat and mouse thing during the suffragette movement, where the women would go on hunger strike and then get better and then be released and then be caught again.
Same again. Yeah.
And
wearing
just
down
after 4 times, then
using people as an example publicly, so to try to get other people not to go. So different kinds of policing tactics. And then one of the big things in both that's important, I think, for understanding the kind of policing of the violence at Greenham, but also its signs, was the role that this perimeter fence played in the life of the camp, because the perimeter fence was what would keep the soldiers, RAF, sometimes the police would be on the inside, sometimes, and obviously the kind of war machinery was all on the inside of the fence. And then the women's camps were on the outside of the fence. So the fence itself became a sign of Greenham, like a symbol of Greenham. But then, and also this kind of, I talk about in my work that it was almost like a communication technology, like it mediated the communication between people on both sides of the fence. Also, the women would climb over the fence to break into the camp, probably especially at Blue Gate. They would cut the fence. They would make sculptures out of bits of wire for the fence. They made cooking grills out of bits of fence, hang the clothes on bits of fence. And then they also used the fence as a canvas, and they would decorate the fence. And that was one of the places where webs appeared, among many other things.
Well, and in some ways, from what you're saying, the web was that the fence was already a form of web, because it has this duality of function and form, and it's wonderful to hear how they were using it.
I mean, and if you think of things being caught in the web, they were using the fact that you could stick things to the open hole structure of this fence. To create, to make protest art, to make signs, to put signs up, to dry their clothes. So there was this functionality, a creativeness and expressiveness that was happening through the technology of the fence. And the fence is this kind of poster board, or exhibition wall for the camp.
I mean, that's sort of, I suppose it's a cliche to and not true, that women are these sort of sole detainers of sensibilities and creativity, but one can imagine quite a different setup with a fully male population with the fence,
Yes, probably wouldn't have been pinning baby clothes on it, or or doing their knitting into the these beautiful rainbow sculptures and often of webs. So one of the ways of webbing was webbing the fence, so creating the kind, with yarn, knitted webs around.
Right. Using it as a sort of matrix to
exactly.
To make
like a loom. I don't know.
Like a loom. Yes. Like the functional. I love how women get very functional quite quickly. Okay, what can this be?
Yeah, and I think that's to me. So in the broader work that I do on protest camps, like this is one of my favorite things about them is like you're living there, you're camping, right? And when we camp, we turn all kinds of objects into other objects, and we make do with very little, and we get really creative in how we set up our home because we're living there. We're living there in the outside with a tent and a few objects, and so there's this like level of creativity that has to come into just reproducing daily life. And then they're also protesting at the same time. So you get this creative, artistic, functional kind of thing going on, which is really, really neat to watch.
Yeah. And I wonder what the attitude of, because you were saying before, this is before the arrival of the protesters, this is a very testosterone heavy place. I'm probably using the use of hormones incorrectly, but the army personnel and you have police at the time, like in the 80s, I cannot imagine that the police force was very mixed
No,
in terms of
I think it was
gender.
almost all men. Yeah, I think there was mostly.
Right.
And then the kinds of depictions you see, like the drawings that they did and the photographs that you can see in the archives and the few videos that exist, it's very much like that. Like it's very much that the soldiers are men, the police are men, the bailiffs are men. A lot of the journalists are men, not always.
Right.
But there's that kind of offset. There weren't, because I think men were occasionally allowed to come to the camp to visit her, like for the big event days, but they weren't allowed to stay over, though I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember exactly what the rule was. Or maybe they were allowed at like the Yellow Gate to visit only. So you also had what is a super, super rare, which is like a women's only space that went on for years, right? And so
it
all
wasn't theological.
Yes, yeah, but not nuns. Very much not nuns. In fact, Greenham was known for a place that women came with husbands and left with girlfriends. So
there are some passages in my mother's book. Let's say pages were turned rapidly.
By you, so you didn't have to see what your mom was up to.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't need to know that much detail.
I want to know.
No,
I mean,
I'll just talk about that very briefly because it's not the point. But it's sort of biographical, and what she brought to the character was actually kind of Candide. She was working class from Liverpool 8, so she brought this very different mindset to a place where it was essentially very middle class women at that point when she joined, and so the class aspect was quite interesting as well. But this is just a digression. But
so I think the fact that it was this very women's centered and sapphic, I guess, for the words that they use then, the words we use now, of course, are not the same, and what we mean by women is not the same. But like, because it was this certain kind of energy and symbolism, you also saw a lot of the two women signs, like the conjoined kind of Venus, is it Venus signs, and you saw a few other kinds of, I guess, what we'd say are lesbian or sapphic symbols, and you had just a lot of this kind of like anarchic sexual energy. But there were lots of nuns there and other kinds of people that were older, people that were coming from different kinds of life, people from the unions, people from the CND or the larger anti-nuclear movement. So you had all different kinds of intersections of people coming together. So there wasn't really like a kind of, I wouldn't say that the queer symbol like ideology was dominant, but it was very prevalent and sat alongside these other kinds of ecological, more religious, more anti-nuclear kinds of symbolism we're more used to seeing in a kind of peace movement or protest.
And probably sat alongside them in such a way that was didn't need to be stated. So I can imagine that women who had perhaps thought outside the box when they got to Greenham, it was for many of them the first time that they talked to other women. I mean, it's like, what test is it? Bechdel?
Yeah, but the thing with the two women talking to each other and there's not like a man in the scene. Yeah, Bechdel test,
Exactly. So I can imagine that for most of the women who went, well, a lot of them, they were having conversations about, for the first time, about something other than their husbands, their sons, their daughters, their their obligation, their domestic obligations.
Yeah.
But
Or if
still
they
taking care.
yeah. And or if they, like I was just going to say, if they had, maybe they had more women friends, but then they went into domestic life and then they came from domestic life back to this more women's only space. So yeah, you had all kinds of, because I think there were, of course, a population of women who lived, as dykes and lived queer lives already that came to Greenham, but there was many more that were, like you're saying, that were married, that had kids, that were young and in university and hadn't kind of started thinking about any of this stuff yet. And this was like a moment of awakening. And the other thing I found really interesting, and if anyone listening wants to know lots of things about the gay women at Greenham, Sasha Rosenneal has 2 books just on queer stuff at Greenham that are, so they also they did all these songs. There's all these very gay songs that came out of Greenham, and that people have singing. I have a paper that's published on that has some of the amazing kind of song lyrics in it. But yeah, so one of the other things that the women said was that a lot of them didn't know the functional skills. So things like, how to fix stuff, how to use tools, how to use a bolt cutter, how to use a hammer. These are things that they wouldn't normally have done because they would have turned to the men in their lives to do them. And all of a sudden it was women teaching women how to do all of this kind of like DIY functional stuff, which I also think is super cool and something that just doesn't happen that much. Like even with as far as we've gotten, that's still something that's really rare, that women teaching
absolutely
women
yes. I don't think we've moved the mark at the cursor very far. And if anything, the men also have unlearned how to do those things,
which not to is a shame, real shame, because they're struggling with what to hold on to with masculinity, and DIY still is like a positive. Like, why can't the manosphere be full of men teaching men how to do DIY?
But instead we have this sort of descent to equality, which isn't very good for anyone. Anyway, to come back to the sign of the sign and the symbolic of the fans. So you mentioned these webs that were knitted by, well, the few things I've seen about it. You shared a paper with me with some images, etc.
Yeah.
And that was quite interesting because, the intervention of the police was, I don't know, the fact that these webs were quite annoying it was difficult to remove them, apparently.
I mean, causing a nuisance was one of the main sort of daily protest tactics of the women. And I think and that's, again, I think there's something quite British about that form of creative resistance. Like, because the police are not as heavy-handed, what historically has happened in England is that you can get away with a lot more sort of nuisance-based, creative or destructive tactics without the police, without putting your life in danger. And that's, of course, not going to be true for everyone who's embodied in every way. But for the most of the women who were there, the police wouldn't have wanted to be seen like beating someone to a pulp, and they didn't use things like tear gas, or water cannons or any of these other kinds of mass dispersal things. So that you could kind of just like be a nuisance until you got arrested or you got detained or they took something away from you. And so there was a lot of that, like you were saying, the cat and mouse. There was a lot of this kind of chasing, and they actually described it often as a cat and mouse kind of game between the police. And probably some of that was boredom. Like, they were there all day, like every day. They needed stuff to do. Yeah, I mean, and there were larger acts of, I guess, what the police would call, vandalism, where they broke in and would paint things or do things on the military base. And there's a famous image of women dancing on the top of the missile silos, which is quite an amazing sign or symbol to have emerged out of Greenham. We still see that one come up sometimes. And they were doing something called the spiral dance, which comes from Starhawk's work, who was big in that. I mean, she's still big, but was big in the 1980s and influential in these movements. And the spiral dance is a dance where everybody comes face to face with each other. So it's quite symbolic in itself. It's also a symbolic dance on this symbolic scene of dancing on top of the missile silos. And I love this as a kind of image of how we intervene in that sort of dominance of imperial war technology. Like, there's something so irreverent about that sort of interruption of that technology. Now you'd probably be shot if you broke into a military base and dance on top of the silo. So this was a different time. I'm not suggesting that we dance on top of
that people do this. But effectively at that time, that really, and that's what's why I'm so happy to have you today, is that because we're at a time when I think it's important to remember that those times existed, and it wasn't actually very long ago that protest could take a creative form without endangering the person doing the creative protest, that, because I think it's good to keep in mind that it's not that long ago. We could perhaps go back to something, I'm just being positive and utopian today.
Yeah, I think what we have seen in the UK is an interesting, case study for this, because the UK tends to do, surveillance, containment, and legislation more than direct violence as its means of protest policing. And so what we've seen in the last few years in the UK are very extreme laws coming out against protest. And that's where we're seeing like the criminalization of any pro-Palestinian types of protest, like anything they remotely consider to be like a direct action is like a jailable offense. And even though these cases are all being brought to court and the police or the state are losing the legal cases, but they're making the laws, they're putting the fear in there, changing the nature of what you can do in protest, and this has a whole history in the UK of in the 90s. They tried to make noise, like sound, illegal so that people wouldn't have street parties. And then now they again went with the decriminalization of certain kinds of sound and certain kinds of signs. And now that was a lot targeted against Extinction Rebellion and now against kind of pro-Palestinian demonstrators. So it limits what then you feel as a protester you can do creatively as a form of protest expression because of the repercussions. I mean, even if you win your lawsuit, that's 3 years of your life, 2 or 3 years of your life that have been incredibly messed up, and emotionally messed up. So it's not so simple. For the rest of us, it's nice to hear the victories of the cases. Living through it is, a really hard.
Absolutely. Especially if you're young. I was thinking of the young ladies who are the Extinction Rebellion for the Campbell soup thing. Not the Campbell soup. That's Warhol. I'm conflating two things.
The throwing
the soup. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that was disproportionate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Justice.
And then and it's stuff even that like some of the, groups that I was involved in the early 2000s, like the stuff that we could do and not really worry about that sort of repercussion was so much greater than what's possible now.
Yeah.
And that is, it's a real shame because it's very hard to get the media to change the narrative or to cover issues in a different way. And if we're criminalizing basic symbolic acts of protest, then we leave very little room, for dissent and for democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, I don't know if you agree with this, but that, because these things were relayed in the media, and so people were able to see these forms of creative dissent, the embodiment and the recuperation of the public space, in such a way that I don't know, my sentiment today is that even the civilian public space, even when it's not protesting, is policed in such a way that people, I don't know, I have the impression people are more sort of self-censoring in the public space.
Yes. Yeah. And that, I think there probably is an intersection there with the rise of social media as well. So, which is also, police and people also stop what they're saying, but that a lot of the kinds of expression that we would have had to do in public spaces together outside, has moved into digital territory. And so the interaction between the digital and the, we could say, and the organizing, all the organizing we don't see in the closed rooms and the assembly halls, that social media has really changed the landscape of that. And one of the things that fascinated me about Greenham, as someone who was only a young child when it was happening and lived in the US, not the UK, was when I accidentally actually found the Greenham archives. I wasn't looking for them. I was interested though in feminist activism before the internet. And it was really fascinating to think about Greenham as kind of one of the last movements that happened before the start of the web. And so even in the 90s, we start to see a little bit of like nascent websites being used or like, ticker tape texting being used, whereas this was a period, no mobile phones, sometimes they were using mimeographs and not even photocopiers for distributing or copying some of their leaflets. And if you had to, maybe they had walkie talkies, like, but they would like bicycle around the gates of the camp to like send messages. Like they weren't just like,
Yeah.
texting in
Yeah.
real time. And it's just, it completely changes like what communication was like, and probably part of the reason we have so much rich making is because people weren't on their phones making memes all the time. They were actually like
Yes.
making, you know.
Well, they were, yeah, they were integrated, and it wasn't meta, was it? They weren't also thinking about what they were sounding and looking like as they were
Yes,
doing it, for
that's really
sure.
interesting. That's really
Which I
interesting. Other
think
than
probably
maybe to each
takes,
other. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it could take the edge off what you're doing considerably.
Yeah. Yeah. That you're not going to be recorded in the same way. I mean, likewise, you're not able to record the police or the violence in the same way. So it does have, effects on both sides. But yeah, I think probably particularly for young people, and I think if we think about the exploration, like the self-explorations that people were doing at the camp, then knowing that that wasn't all going to be documented on social media. So you could have, you could explore outside your marriage, your newfound sapphic, existence without thinking that it was going to be documented all over, So that was probably a big change
Yes.
in
And
what,
just
in
have the
how
time,
people
I
act.
suppose. It's such, social media is such a time sink
Yeah.
that, of course, if something version of Greenham existed today, of course, activist women would be on their phones
Yeah.
doing a mix of diverse things,
Yeah.
and, not having those conversations, because I think, aside from the sort of sapphic explorations, there were conversations about their, quite simply, their lack of agency or their
Yeah.
situation in their real lives back home.
Yeah. 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 That were
Yeah.
quite transformative for them. Yeah. And all these, these skills of self-discovery, talking about politics with other women. I really like your idea of thinking about it as a Bechdel test, but for real life. These would have been, maybe they would have talked about environmentalism and nuclear disarmament with their husbands, or, maybe with some coworkers, but not in groups of women like this.
Right.
And I think that is a really
Yeah.
powerful thing. And I think we haven't really had, it's been a long, because single gendered spaces are different in the world that we're in now, and they have different politics because we don't have as many of them. And certainly not at that scale. We don't really know what would it look like, if we had something,
Mm,
like that now. It would have different, it would have different parameters, but that it would still probably do a lot of the consciousness raising work that
yeah.
Greenham did, particularly for women who weren't already in those kinds of spaces, before they got there. And a lot of times, protest camps now, they do have rules around phones and places phones can't be, and phones not in
Yeah.
meetings, and so we do still have. I think protest camps still do provide a sense of convergence and chat and connection that, like, just a demo or just a march isn't kind of long enough, doesn't have enough downtime to have those
That's
same kinds of
interesting.
interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
when you're figuring out how to live with someone and not just protest for 2 hours or 3 hours with them, right? It's a
Yeah.
very different stakes. And I think that's why we see such interesting politics emerge, particularly at places like tar sands protests, like in France, in Lausanne, in Italy against the trains, like things that are a little more rural or not just like in a city, in an urban context, which also is an important thing about Greenham. It's in that base camp is like, there's not stuff around it, like it is
Yeah.
removed from a kind of city or
Yes.
urban environment. And I think that's actually really important for thinking about the ways that connections develop slowly and creativity develops slowly. And there's all this downtime. And they're battling the
Yes.
weather, and the elements, and all this is going on too, which is really different than a demonstration that takes place for 2 or 3 hours in an urban city street.
Yeah. It's a destination. I mean, it's such a more weighted decision to go all the way to Greenham Common than
Mm.
to, I'm not saying, of course, like people who go to Trafalgar Square, but that you could go almost like on your lunch break, couldn't you?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, in fact, I used to go to Occupy London on my lunch break. You could just go for a couple hours. I took my students one day. I was like, oh, let's just go to St. Paul's Cathedral. So yeah, it's completely different.
Yeah. Do we have any idea of the media reception of Greenham? And, because I imagine that for a lot of people, they're seeing this array of women But in the photographs, it's quite moving actually to look at the photos, because you have an array of women, and some of them do just look like someone's mum,
Yeah.
in the nicest possible way I can say that. I can't remember how it was received, because I was, a preteen or a teen. Yeah. But yeah, the UK media, is renowned for being absolutely savage, especially
Yes.
the
Yes.
tabloids.
Yes.
So, but we didn't get tabloids. So I don't know I don't know if you have an idea of what
Yeah,
the
it was
reception
pretty,
was.
yeah, it was savage. And there was a lot of the kind of belittling that you would imagine of like feminists and, a lot of kind of calling people dykes and a lot of like,
Right.
not in the reclaimed way. And a lot of just like making the women look really like, the ugly witch,
Mm,
or like really, with all the body hair, like is everywhere, and the kinds of stereotypes that you would get, especially in the 80s, of what kind of a feminist would be. And the women had a lot of fun with this. I mean, I'm sure it also occasionally like stung, but the women would, kind of were quite good. Kind of like the Green Party is right now. We were quite good at like knowing what to expect, not taking it too seriously, giving it back, turning it around, reclaiming the things that they were called in their songs and in their flyers. And
right.
so it was a really powerful, and I think that's another thing that happens when you have a big group of people, you have a big group of women together, that it's much easier
Yeah.
when you're a big group to reclaim those kinds of derogatory or hate speech.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. It's absolutely a lot easier to do as a group.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, yeah. So, yeah. So it's the kind of media coverage I would say that you would expect. And occasionally there were also positive stories, especially in the more liberal leaning press, like The Guardian would be quite supportive. And then you also had at the time a lot of all the alternative press was thriving in the UK. And so you had the CND had its own publication, Peace News. You had Spare Rib, this feminist magazine. You had something called
Mm,
Outright, which is a POC, women of color led a newspaper. There was some like feminist newsletters. Like there was quite a lot of alternative press circulating around. So if you were in those scenes already and you were hanging out in the radical, bookshops and cafes, and
yeah.
in the 80s, there was still a lot more of those kinds of community spaces also, then you also saw a lot of positive news and a lot of debate. So a lot of the discussions about, Greenham and solidarity, what was nonviolence, what was violence, was the camp too white, like was there space for different kinds of sexualities, like those debates were happening a lot in that movement media. So that was, again, we don't have the internet, so these discussions aren't happening on Instagram or the Facebook page, or TikTok. They're happening in newsletters and letters to the editors, and debates or dialogues that are being captured in
Yeah.
print, because that was how we had to circulate information before we had social media. So again, all this kind of making and crafting that was happening. And that's where, to go back to the symbols, we also see a lot of webs and other kinds of these key Greenham symbols, because they would be sort of scrawled into the margins, right? You have marginalia when you have hand photocopied print things. And so you would see a lot of the kind of symbology of Greenham sort of reproduced through this kind of media. And then the Greenham women also made their own media. So they made zines and newsletters they put together stories at the camp, and then someone would like go to an office and, piece it together and get it photocopied. And they're beautiful, like they're like works of art, then, and they're just
Yeah.
covered in cartoons and little drawings and graphics of all of these,
Wow.
symbols of the camp.
I was wondering what you were saying about the symbology and the marginalia and stuff. That's really cool, actually. Like young women today and older women, actually, and trans and anyone, identifying with these feminist, creative ideas. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I see online, the idea of the witch has returned.
Yes. Yes. The witch is very big right now.
I was in Edinburgh recently, and there's several shops, with queues, humongous queues, lines outside of young people waiting to get their various instruments for the arts. And it's not Harry Potter, because
Yeah.
initially I thought it was Harry Potter
Okay.
adjacent, but it's really about it's sort of moon calendars and all of these sort of ancient things, actually. And I've got lost in my question, but that's fine.
Yeah, no, we can talk about witches and webs. So yeah, the witch was
was it linked?
The witch was one of the reclaimed
Okay.
symbols at Greenham. And there's actually a lovely song called it's a Greenham, We Are the Witches song. And the web and the witch are linked as well, as they are in popular culture. So that was one of the reasons, another reason for the popularity of the web, because the web meant many things. But yeah, the reclamation of witches then is very similar to why we see it now. So it was about, these were the healers, and the feminists of their time that were persecuted and pushed out. And again, I think what we were talking about like all of a sudden you have this group of people together. So they're not feeling like the isolated one who's causing trouble by speaking up. All of a sudden, all the isolated ones who speak up are living together, right? Or are brought together into this space. And so that's a really powerful, transformative moment. And so this idea that we are the witches together, is I think, a quite kind of powerful movement.
Yes, it's probably a lot harder to be an isolated witch.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not sure how many people would have taken that identity prior to coming to Greenham. Like, it's another one of those identities that I think was spread and shared as part of the culture of the camp. Whereas I would say now witchiness is a little bit more mainstream and a little bit more, kind of quite overtly linked to feminism in a kind of reclaimed.
Yeah, there's a kind of semantic bleaching, or at least a semantic sort of transition, isn't there, with the whole idea of what a witch is.
Yes, and going back to the kind of pagan healer roots of witchiness. And so I think that line of, I mean, God, there's so many. I had a book that like goes through all the different types of witches. There's so many types of witches, but I think we in generalize them as the kind of healer pagan-y types of witch, green witches.
Yeah, we have a lot more identity. That comes back to what you were saying before. Yeah, the healer pagan-y thing of you mentioned before. The one of the confrontations every day was with the weather. So it all that ties in as well. It's a very embodied, situated.
Yeah, totally. And I wasn't as witchy as I am now when I was writing my PhD and doing this research in the archives. But I wonder if any young people listening who are going to research Greenham Common, I think it would be really fun to go back to the archives and look and see what other kinds of witchy behaviors there might have been there. Because I wonder if they did talk a lot about things like the moon phases and menstrual cycles and these other things that we would associate with a more kind of modern day witch. My guess would be that there is stuff in the archive that would show them. And someone might have written this paper. I haven't come across it if they have. But it's one of these things.
Possibly somebody's written about the massive synchronization of everybody's menstrual cycles. Yeah.
But it's one of those, and I think this is an interesting thing with any of these kinds of archives. And I'd really encourage, young feminists or listeners to go to one of your archives and look through this kind of material, particularly from the kind of 70s and 80s and 90s before the internet, because it's just the symbols, the signs, the ways that they're creating and using these are absolutely fascinating and really help contextualize and connect us to the present moment and to our kind of, not necessarily our own ancestors, but our kind of political ancestral paths. And there's going to be all kinds of things in the archives that people haven't researched yet. So I remember when I was a wee researcher and I was asking Sasha Rosenell, who's written these books on queer Greenham, I think I was asking her maybe about bisexual and trans like issues at the camp. And she was like, one, for the bisexual, she was like, well, I wasn't looking at that. So like, I'm sure there were loads of people talking about bisexuality, but I didn't ask them in my interviews. So like, that's one of these things that probably you could write an entire dissertation on bisexuality at Greenham Common and what it meant, but like it's just never been researched, it's never been asked. So, and then trans wasn't even like really in the vocabulary in the way that it is now at that time, and so you didn't have who counts as a woman debates of who gets to be in this space, because those debates also weren't quite yet happening, at least not in the language we would recognize today in the movement more broadly at that time.
They were still so marginalized, weren't they? Trans at that point.
Yeah, and like non-binary didn't exist as a gender category, as a gender identification. So you could definitely go back and look at precursors to that, and you could probably find some really interesting things around, more complicated gender identity, looking through the lens of today. But nobody's done that or at least to my knowledge, no one's done that research yet, because it requires, to be really contemporary and then trying to understand the past through a contemporary lens, which is a challenge, and that's certainly not a traditional historical approach. So you might need to be in cultural studies if you're doing that. But
no, for sure. I mean, I think it would probably be for people who do digital humanities, there's probably sort of ways of exploring all this, because there must be quite a lot of data to go through. That'd be fascinating.
And a lot of the legacies, like a lot of these symbols moved. And so the web in particular was a very reproducible symbol about Greenham. So you started to see the web in the other camps that were the kind of solidarity or sister camps that started. So the one in Italy was actually called La Ragnatela, which is the web, and then lots of witches in the Italy camp. And the kind of slogan of Greenham women everywhere, we are everywhere, would often use the web as its kind of symbol to kind of show that connection and that solidarity beyond the geographic location of Greenham itself. So in terms of also that idea of like the web linking the different camps together, at one point, I feel like it was 1983, used the web as the main visual image for the kind of promotion of a big kind of event that was happening. And it was talking about widening the web. And then around the outside of the web, you had written all of these different kinds of campaigns, so linking it to things like anti-apartheid, linking it to things like nuclear testing in the Pacific. And there was really this kind of effort to reflect on the whiteness of Greenham Common, the middle classness of Greenham Common, and think about what it would mean to kind of be in solidarity with other kinds of issues, other kinds of causes. What was the link between UK-US imperialism and these other movements around the world? So there's a really interesting moment that happens a few years into the camp where people start thinking more broadly about their own identities and about solidarity and about what that might look like and how you might support other campaigns from the place or the site of Greenham Common. And I love how the web became the symbol for this idea of widening our solidarity networks.
I think we'll end it on that. That was so well said. Thank you so much for coming in. It was an absolute pleasure.
This was really fun.
So I'll just say officially goodbye. So goodbye, Anna Feigenbaum.
All right, thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.